The call came at 1:09 in the morning, and I knew before I answered that it wasn't routine. At my age, the phone doesn't ring at that hour without reason, and I've lived long enough to understand that reasons like that rarely announce themselves clearly. I let it ring once more before picking it up, steadying my voice before I spoke. When I heard hers, I didn't interrupt. There was something in the way she held her breath between words that told me this had been building long before tonight. "Dad, please come get me." There was no panic in her voice, no raised tone, nothing that would draw attention if someone else were listening. It was controlled, measured, almost careful. That alone told me more than urgency would have. She wasn't reacting to something sudden. She was navigating something ongoing, something she had already tried to manage on her own. "Where are you?" I asked. "At the house." A pause followed, longer than necessary, but not empty. I waited it out. I've learned that silence, when it comes like that, carries information. He says I can't leave. That was enough. Not because of what it meant on the surface, but because of how she said it. Not as a complaint, not as confusion, but as a statement she had already heard repeated more than once. I didn't ask her to explain. Explanations can wait when the structure of a situation is already visible. "I'm on my way," I said. She didn't respond. The line went quiet, then ended. I got dressed without rushing. There's a difference between speed and readiness, and I wasn't interested in arriving unprepared. I've spent years watching how small decisions made under pressure tend to favor whoever planned ahead. If there was one thing I was certain of, it was that someone in that house had been planning. The drive was steady, controlled. Roads were empty, lights cycling through their patterns with no one to respond to them. I followed them anyway. Discipline isn't situational. It's consistent. As I drove, I didn't try to piece together details I didn't have. Instead, I focused on what I knew. My daughter doesn't call at 2 a.m. unless she has already exhausted her options. When I turned onto their street, I saw the lights immediately. Not just one or two, but several, positioned in a way that suggested intention rather than oversight. The house looked exactly as it always had from the outside, maintained, stable, settled. It was the kind of stability people trust without question. I parked along the curb instead of pulling into the driveway. It gave me distance, and distance provides perspective. When I stepped out, the air was still, carrying sound further than usual. My footsteps, the closing of the car door, even my breathing felt more present than they should have. I rang the bell once. It took time before the door opened, long enough to confirm that I had been seen before I was acknowledged. When it did open, he stood there already composed, already awake, already prepared. His posture wasn't defensive or welcoming. It was controlled, like someone who had anticipated this exact moment. "She called you," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded once and stepped forward, not waiting for an invitation. "Where is she?" I asked. "Upstairs." He moved just enough to clear the doorway, but he didn't step aside completely. It was a small detail, but it told me everything about how he positioned himself in the situation, not obstructing, not assisting, just present. The house felt unchanged on the surface, clean, ordered, exactly how she had always kept it, but there was a stillness underneath it, something quieter than silence, something structured. It felt like a place where decisions had already been made. I found her in the guest room, sitting at the edge of the bed. That alone stood out. She had always used the main bedroom, always kept her space consistent. The shift told me something had already been redefined inside this house before I arrived. She looked up at me, her expression steady but not relaxed. Her hands were clenched in a way that didn't match the calm in her voice. She wasn't panicking. She was holding herself in place. "You came," she said. I nodded once. "Let's go." She didn't stand immediately. Her eyes moved past me toward the doorway, where he had positioned himself just outside, close enough to hear without stepping in. She didn't look surprised to see him there. "He says I can't," she said. Her tone hadn't changed. It wasn't resistance. It was repetition. She was stating a condition that had been set for her. "I didn't say she can't leave," he said from the hallway. His voice was even, measured, almost patient. "I said it doesn't change anything if she does." I turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him without shifting my position fully. There was no urgency in him, no attempt to escalate. That kind of calm doesn't come from uncertainty. It comes from preparation. "What does that mean?" I asked. He met my gaze without hesitation. "It means she signed everything." He didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. The sentence carried its own weight. I let it sit there for a moment, not responding immediately. Sometimes the first explanation is incomplete by design. Silence gives people space to clarify. "The house, the accounts, the liabilities," he continued, "all transferred. It's all in her name." I turned back to her. "Is that true?" She nodded. "Yes." No resistance, no correction, just confirmation. "When?" I asked. "Over the past year," she said. "Documents, agreements." He said it was restructuring. Her voice remained steady, but there was a shift in her breathing now, not panic, but recognition. She was beginning to see something she hadn't fully seen before. "And you signed them?" Another nod. "Yes." There was a pause, then she added quietly, "I didn't read everything." That detail didn't surprise me. Trust has a way of presenting itself as efficiency. When you believe in the person across from you, you don't question every page. You assume alignment. I stepped further into the room. "Get your things." She hesitated, not out of refusal, but out of uncertainty about what leaving would mean. I didn't give her time to settle into that thought. "We're not discussing it here," I said. She stood slowly, adjusting to the shift. He remained in the hallway, watching without intervening. When she moved toward the door, he spoke again, just as calmly as before. "You're free to go," he said, "but it doesn't change anything." This time I looked at him directly. There was no strain in his voice, no attempt to assert control physically. He didn't need to. Whatever he believed had been secured wasn't dependent on presence. We left without further conversation. She had a small bag already prepared, which told me the decision to leave hadn't started tonight. The call had been the final step, not the first. At the car, she paused before getting in. "He showed me some of it," she said. "Statements, papers, my name everywhere." I waited. "There were numbers I didn't recognize," she added. That was the first real indication of scale, not just ownership, but exposure. I opened the car door and let her sit before closing it. As I drove away, I didn't look back. Whatever had been arranged inside that house wasn't going to be undone by distance alone. The way he had said it, the precision in his tone, told me this wasn't a claim built on assumption. She signed everything. Statements like that don't come from confidence alone. They come from documents. And documents, once signed, don't just transfer control. They define responsibility. And responsibility doesn't wait for understanding to catch up. As we drove in silence, I could feel the weight of that distinction settling in, not just for her, but for what I would need to do next. Ownership can be reversed, challenged, negotiated. Liability, once attached, tends to move differently. It follows the name on the page, not the intent behind the signature. I didn't take her to my house immediately. Instead, I stopped at a quiet roadside area a few minutes away, somewhere neutral, somewhere without history. It wasn't about delaying safety. It was about creating space to think before anything else interfered. She didn't question it, which told me she understood the shift that had already begun. "Tell me exactly what you remember," I said, keeping my voice even. She stared ahead for a moment before speaking, as if organizing fragments into something coherent. "It started small," she said. "Bank forms, joint account adjustments, things he said would simplify taxes and planning." Her tone remained steady, but her hands tightened again in her lap. Then it became transfers, ownership changes, refinances. Each time he explained it like it was temporary or protective. I let her continue without interruption. Interrupting would only break the sequence of her recall, and I needed it intact. "He handled most of it," she said. "Appointments, documents, meetings. I just signed where he indicated." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only acknowledgement. "He said it was better if everything was streamlined under one name." "And that name was yours," I said. She nodded. "Yes." That confirmed the structure, but not the scale. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small notebook I kept there, flipping it open without looking at her. Writing things down gives them shape, even when the full picture isn't visible yet. "What kind of numbers?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. Larger than anything we've ever had." Her voice dropped slightly, not from fear, but from realization. "Loans, I think. Lines of credit. I saw statements with balances that didn't make sense to me." That was the second layer. Not just transferred ownership, but attached exposure. I noted it without reacting outwardly. "Did you ever ask for copies?" I asked. "I did at first," she said. "He said he'd handle it, that everything was already documented and filed." She paused, then added, "Later, I stopped asking. It always came back to the same answer. Consistency like that isn't accidental. It's maintained." I closed the notebook and set it back in place. "We're going to need those documents," I said. She nodded, but there was hesitation behind it. "He keeps everything in his office," she said, "locked." I started the engine again. "Then we'll get access another way." We reached my house shortly after. I didn't turn on the main lights when we entered, just enough to make the space functional. Brightness can feel like exposure when someone is trying to process something this precise. She sat at the dining table while I brought her a glass of water, placing it in front of her without comment. "What did he show you tonight?" I asked. She looked down at the table, tracing a small line with her finger as she spoke. "A folder," she said. "Printed statements, agreements, signatures, my name on all of them." Her voice remained controlled, but there was a subtle shift now, something closer to clarity than confusion. He pointed to specific sections, numbers, dates. "And what did he say?" I asked. She lifted her gaze to meet mine. "That everything tied back to me," she said. "That legally it's all mine. The house, the accounts, and the debts." There it was, not implied, not suggested, stated. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the information settle into place. "Did he mention his own name anywhere in those documents?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, that's what didn't feel right." She paused, then added, It was like he wasn't part of it anymore. That confirmed the structure more clearly. Not shared responsibility, transferred responsibility. I stood and walked to the small cabinet near the wall, retrieving a folder of my own. Inside were contact details, documents, and notes I had kept over the years. Not for situations like this specifically, but for anything that required precision. "We're not going back there tonight," I said. "But tomorrow, we start pulling records." She watched me as I placed the folder on the table. "From where?" "Everywhere they exist," I said. "Banks, registries, any institution tied to those documents." I met her gaze directly. "Paper leaves a trail. It always does." She nodded slowly, absorbing the shift from reaction to process. That's where control begins, not in confrontation, but in understanding structure. "What if it's all valid?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't have one, but because the answer needed to be placed carefully. "Validity doesn't end the conversation," I said. "It defines the starting point." She held that for a moment, then looked away, back toward the table. The fear wasn't visible in her expression, but it was present in the way she processed the idea. Not of loss, but of responsibility she hadn't chosen knowingly. I stood and moved toward the window, looking out into the dark street. Situations like this don't resolve through emotion, they resolve through structure. And structure requires evidence. Behind me, she spoke again. "He was certain," she said, "when he said it, like nothing could change it." I turned slightly enough to respond without fully facing her. "Certainty like that usually comes from documentation," I said, "but documentation can be examined." She didn't reply, but I could sense the shift in her posture. Not relief, but alignment. She was beginning to move from reaction into participation. "We start in the morning," I said. "We gather everything tied to your name, every account, every agreement, every transfer." I paused, then added, "And we do it quietly." She nodded once. The situation hadn't changed yet. The documents still existed. The signatures still carried weight. And whatever had been structured under her name was still in place. But something had shifted, even if only slightly. The difference between being positioned and being aware of that position is where the process begins. Awareness changes nothing externally at first, but internally it shifts every decision that follows. That night, I didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because the structure of what I had heard demanded verification before rest was even an option. I started early the next morning before she woke. The first calls were to institutions I had worked with in the past, not to make accusations, but to request records under standard verification procedures. Names, account identifiers, transaction histories, nothing emotional, nothing interpretive, just data. Data doesn't argue back. It only reveals patterns when placed side by side. By the time she came into the kitchen, I already had 3 printed summaries on the table. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at them as if trying to recognize her own life. Translated into columns and numbers, I watched her carefully, not to judge her reaction, but to measure what she was beginning to see. "Is this everything?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "But it's enough to start seeing the structure." She sat down slowly, pulling one of the pages closer. Her eyes moved across the lines without stopping. I could tell she wasn't reading for detail yet, but for confirmation that it was real. People often expect financial documents to feel abstract until they realize every number corresponds to a decision. "There are loans here I don't remember agreeing to," she said quietly. "That's why we trace timing," I replied, "not memory." I spread the document slightly, aligning dates where possible. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious in isolation, but when layered, it became harder to ignore. Transfers increasing after certain signatures, credit extensions tied to specific authorization points, refinancing cycles that repeated at intervals just short of suspicion thresholds. She noticed it too. Her hand paused over one of the pages. "These dates," she said, "these are the weeks he told me everything was being simplified." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to see the correlation without interference. The realization needed to form on its own. "Was there ever a time you saw all of this together?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. Always in pieces, never like this." That was intentional, whether by design or consequence. Fragmentation reduces resistance. When information is divided, it feels manageable. When combined, it changes scale. I leaned back, slightly observing the full layout now forming across the table. "Then we treat it as one system," I said, "not separate actions." She looked up at me. "And what does that mean?" "It means whoever structured this didn't do it randomly," I said. "It means there is a sequence, and sequences can be reconstructed." She didn't respond immediately, but I could see her processing the implication. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to what had been done. She was beginning to consider how it had been done. The next step was access to originals. Copies only confirm patterns. Originals confirm intent. I made 2 more calls, this time requesting archived filings and certified copies of signed agreements. It took time, but not resistance. Institutions move slowly, but they don't conceal what is properly requested. By afternoon, we had another set of documents. These were more detailed, stamped, and formally recorded. When I placed them beside the earlier printouts, the structure became clearer. Certain clauses repeated across different agreements. Certain liabilities shifted timing in a way that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. She noticed something I hadn't pointed out. "These signatures," she said, "they look the same, but they're not placed consistently." I glanced at the page. She was right. The positioning varied slightly. Not enough to invalidate them immediately, but enough to suggest they were collected under different conditions. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means context matters," I said, "and context is what we're missing." She leaned back, staring at the table. "So he controlled the context," she said quietly. I didn't correct her. That conclusion wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete either. Control in these situations rarely comes from force. It comes from sequencing decisions in a way that makes each step feel independent. When viewed separately, nothing appears unusual. When viewed together, the intent becomes harder to ignore. We spent the next several hours cross-referencing phone records, email confirmations, appointment logs. I asked her to recall specific meetings, not for emotional detail, but for timing. She did, slowly at first, then with more clarity as patterns began to form in her memory. "There was always a reason to sign quickly," she said at one point. He would say, "Deadlines were approaching." "That's important," I said. "Deadlines create urgency. Urgency replaces review." She nodded slowly, absorbing it. By late afternoon, I had enough to request a formal legal review. Not confrontation yet, just examination. The difference is important. Confrontation assumes conclusion. Review determines it. When I told her this, she didn't hesitate. "Do it," she said. Her voice had changed slightly by then, still controlled, but less uncertain, more anchored in observation than confusion. The lawyer I contacted didn't react emotionally either. That was expected. Cases like this are not about outrage, they are about structure. After a brief explanation, they agreed to review everything within procedural bounds. As the call ended, she spoke again. What happens if they say everything is valid? I looked at her for a moment before answering. Then we examine what validity means in context, I said, because validity doesn't remove consequence. It only defines who carries it. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Later that evening, I received a message confirming preliminary irregularities in documentation sequencing. Not fraud yet, not invalidation, just inconsistencies that required deeper analysis. That alone was enough to shift the direction. I placed the phone down and looked toward her. She was sitting quietly, watching the papers, but no longer reading them continuously. Something had changed in her posture. Not relief, not fear, focus. He built it carefully, she said suddenly. Yes, I replied. And I didn't see it. That wasn't a question. I didn't answer immediately. Because sometimes acknowledgement is not required to assign responsibility. Awareness itself becomes the correction point. You saw what you were shown, I said finally. That's not the same as not seeing. She nodded slowly, accepting that distinction without resistance. Outside, the evening had settled in, the light fading into the kind of quiet that makes decisions feel heavier than they are. Inside, the documents remained spread across the table, no longer just papers, but a mapped sequence of decisions that had quietly reshaped ownership and obligation. The system was now visible. And once a system becomes visible, it stops being unchallenged. Visibility changes the balance of control, not immediately, but inevitably. The following morning, the legal review escalated from preliminary inconsistencies to formal concern. Not because everything was confirmed as wrong, but because the structure of how it had been executed no longer matched standard financial practice. I didn't tell her every detail as it came in. Some information stabilizes people, and some overwhelms them unnecessarily. I only gave her what was necessary to understand direction, that there was sufficient irregularity to question enforceability, that the sequencing of agreements was not as independent as it had been presented, and that further formal action was now justified. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't ask if it meant she was free of responsibility. Instead, she asked something more precise. So this can be challenged? Yes, I said, but it has to be done properly. That distinction mattered. Nothing here would resolve through confrontation alone. It would resolve through structure, documentation, and legal precision. By afternoon, formal correspondence had been initiated. Requests for full disclosure, verification of signing conditions, and audit of transactional flow were sent through proper channels. The response wasn't immediate, but silence in these cases is not absence. It is processing. He called just once that evening. She didn't answer. I did. There was no hostility in his voice, only calm acknowledgement. This won't change what was signed, he said. I listened without interrupting. Everything is recorded, he continued. Everything is documented. That certainty again, the same tone as before, but now I understood its purpose more clearly. It wasn't confidence. It was reliance on structure being accepted without challenge. That will be determined formally, I said, and ended the call. She watched me as I placed the phone down. He sounded sure, she said. People sound sure when they expect no resistance, I replied. The legal process moved faster after that. Once formal review begins, systems that appeared stable start revealing pressure points. Signatures alone were not enough to settle it anymore. The conditions under which they were obtained, the sequence of execution, and the distribution of liability all became central. 2 days later, we were called in for formal clarification, not confrontation, clarification. We went together. The atmosphere inside was controlled, procedural. Papers were not scattered. Voices were not raised. Everything was measured. That environment mattered because truth in situations like this is rarely revealed through emotion. It is revealed through documentation alignment. She was asked to confirm timelines. She did. She was asked about conditions of signing. She answered carefully, consistently. When inconsistencies were presented between documents and recorded procedures, there was no immediate declaration, only acknowledgement that further review was required. That alone shifted the weight of the situation. He was not present in the room, but his position was represented through filings and prior submissions. Calm, structured, consistent, until it wasn't enough. When we left, she didn't speak until we reached the car. I didn't realize how much of it was separated, she said. That's how control works when it's procedural, I replied. It doesn't feel like control while it's happening. She nodded slowly, looking out the window. Days passed with no resolution, but the direction had already changed. What once appeared fixed was now under active review. That alone altered the balance. The final correspondence came quietly. Adjustments to liability classification, suspension of enforceable claims pending full audit, redistribution of certain responsibilities back into contested status. It wasn't victory, not in the emotional sense. It was correction. That evening, she sat across from me. No documents between us this time, just space. So what happens now? She asked. Now it stabilizes, I said. She nodded, absorbing it. There was no celebration, no dramatic relief, only a gradual settling of weight that had been carried without understanding its full shape. Later, as I watched her leave the room to rest, I understood something clearly. Power shifts like this are rarely loud. They don't announce themselves in moments. They appear in the quiet return of balance, after everything has been properly examined. And in that return, nothing is taken back, only corrected.